Yo, what is up guys, Grim here, and today I've got another build video for you guys. So after the cast on comet nerfs came in, we had to find something new, and I figured you guys might be interested in what I ended up landing on. So in this video, I'm going to take you through what I chose and give you guys a bit of a demonstration of how it works and a bit of different mechanics, and try and explain what you might need if you like what you see to roll it yourself. So without further ado, let's get into it. So what is the build? Well, I had to write it down, it's such a mouthful. It is a Stormweaver, Archmage, Mind Over Matter, Eldritch Battery, Chaos Inoculation, Spark, Cast on Shock, Orbital Cannon build. Whew, that is quite a bit there. Now, before we get into a demonstration here, I do quickly want to shout out the build creator, or at least the first person I saw to show it, and that is Berry. He played this as his league starter, and when we all saw it, we had to get in on the action after the cast on comet nerf. So big shout out to him. Now let's get into some action here. So I figured I'd show you guys the build in some different content here. So we're going to start out with a tier 17 boss here, and we're not using my most insane gear. I'll talk about that in a little bit later, but we're using gear which you could reasonably maybe get off of trade. That's the idea here. So tier 17 boss, we're going to come in here and we're going to see how fast he dies here. So here it comes. Where is the cannon? 1 million there. There's another 1 million. There's another 1 million, and he's stunned and he's dead. Alright, so that is a tier 17 boss there, and most of the bosses kind of end up going that way there. You just orbital cannon them for 1 million every time, and they just kind of fall over, and you can kind of stun them as well. It's pretty damn crazy. So you have a ton of damage, and you will notice that we are of course playing Spark. Now, what we've got here is, a pretty decent clearing setup, but it's nothing too insane. Well, this build actually has a weapon swap, which allows you to really take your clear to the next level as well. Just by doing a weapon swap, we can increase the projectile speed of our sparks even more, and if we want, we can even do a gem swap as well, and make it even better here with a bit of gem swapping action here. We can make it so that we can move while casting a little bit better, and we can also use blink. So we have huge single target damage on bosses, we have really great projectile speed and coverage with Spark, and we have mobility with blink. So this build definitely has a lot up its sleeves. So I'm going to quickly do a quick cut here, and I'm going to swap over to a breach, and I'm going to show you guys how the build looks and feels in a breach, so you guys can actually get a feel for the clear as well. Alright, post-cut Grimro here. We've got our breach. Let's take a look and see how it clears. So there's one big thing I want to point out here when we're playing this build though, and that is to try and pay attention to how I'm moving, because you really do want to move in a very specific way with this build to get around some of the downsides that it inherently comes with. So you'll notice that I'm kind of trying to kite away from the monsters at all times here. You don't want to run into the monsters, otherwise you will be in some serious trouble. And I'm using blink to reposition wherever possible. But when you've got big open space between you and the monsters, then you're good to go. You can kind of like really start to push forward. But when there's monsters coming at you, you need to back it up. So that's kind of the way you have to play this build. But you can see the clear is pretty damn good here. You can reposition and get all around and get all the breach monsters with the blink. So you're going to get a lot more than a lot of other builds do out of these breaches, because remember, they get a lot more value the more monsters you kill, because they get extended in terms of duration when you kill more monsters. So that is huge value there by having that blink, and really good coverage is really nice as well, of course. And all these rares, they just die, and that is the orbital cannon at work here. So that orbital cannon is striking down, that's all the beams there, and it's doing work. You do have to still be a bit careful though here. We don't want to get hit by any of these monsters, and I'll explain why. But we got a pretty good amount of loot from that one. Maybe we were a bit slow because I was trying to explain what I was doing, but you can blink around all over the place, and you can really, get a lot of stuff done there. Alright, so with the demonstration covered and out of the way, let's get into the character itself. So there's actually not too much to cover, so let's kick it off with the skills first. So we're using Spark, Flame Wall, Cast on Shock, Lightning Conduit, also known as Orbital Cannon, Archmage, and Blink. So let's get the easy ones out of the way first here. So we have Blink. It's going to require 60 Spirit to reserve, so you may not have enough for it at the very start, but it's something you can work towards later on. And we have it linked to Ingenuity here, which is cooldown reduction. So it just replaces your dodge roll. You can move around as you see fit and reposition. This is particularly good on this build because you really don't want any enemies to hit you in melee, because you are very vulnerable to physical damage, stuns, and freezes, and you do not want them to touch you. So being able to blink away is invaluable. So that's our first skill here. The next skill is Archmage. So Archmage is basically the hallmark of every caster at the moment. It makes it so that based on your mana, you get a ton of free lightning damage. It multiplies whatever the base damage of the ability you have by a massive amount, and it really encourages you to stack mana, and we are doing that. So Archmage is a must-have. Huge damage multiplier, more mana equals more damage. Now, it does make your spells cost quite a lot more, but we'll get to how to fix that real soon. Now, linked to Archmage, we have Clarity, and we have Lightning Mastery, just to juice up its level just a little bit more and reduce those costs. And next up is going to be our Cast on Shock setup here, which is the majority of our single target damage. And it is going to be linked to Lightning Conduit, aka Orbital Cannon. So why is it called Orbital Cannon? Well, it's a big-ass lightning bolt that comes from the sky, which may as well be coming from space. It hits so damn hard. So this one's pretty damn easy. Cast on Shock wasn't really used too much in the past, but in my opinion, it's now one of the better ones. So whenever you shock an enemy, you gain energy. How much energy? Well, it depends on what type of enemy you're shocking. If you're shocking a unique enemy, you'll gain 20 energy. If you're shocking a rare enemy, you'll gain 5. If you get shocking a magic enemy, you get 2. And if you do a normal one, it's 1. Now, the cool thing about Cast on Shock is that those numbers, 25, 2, and 1, are multiplied by 2. So it's actually 40 energy per unique enemy you shock, which is pretty damn good because our spell here, Lightning Conduit, only costs 300 energy to trigger. Now, baseline without any stats, that's not very good. So 300 divided by 40, that's going to take 7.5 shocks on every single unique boss to trigger the beam, which is unacceptable for the most part. So we need to stack a bit of an energy gain modifier here. That's going to improve our breakpoint significantly. And the number you're looking for is 151% here. So if we take 40, which is our energy gained, and times it by 2.52, or 2.51 here in this case, you gain 100.4. And that means that we can get 3 shocks per lightning conduit, because 300 divided by 100 is of course 3. So we change our breakpoint from 7.5 shocks down to 3 shocks, which is over double damage, or double the lightning conduits. So that is the main thing that you need to get for your Cast on Shock, and the very first thing you need to achieve on your build when you're making this build, 151 energy gain multiplier. And don't worry, this is actually very easy to get, because on the new rework to these trigger abilities, the quality gives energy gain modifier, and the gem levels give energy gain modifier as well. And there's also a bunch of it on the tree and jewels, which you can scoop up in addition to that. Alright, so with the boring trigger stuff out of the way, let's get into the namesake of the build. The Big Beam, the Orbital Cannon, the Lightning Conduit. Okay, let's take a look at this ability. Alright, so on the surface, it does a bit of lightning damage. Nothing crazy, nothing too bad though. But it has a very special line here. It says it does 100% more damage with hits per 5% shock effect on the enemy. Now, shock effect is essentially the shock icon, which generally has a number. It's just that divided by 5. So baseline, it's 20%. Any character, whenever they shock without any investment, will be 20%. So any character that is using Lightning Conduit, if they shock an enemy and they cast Lightning Conduit, well, it'll get 400% more damage, because 20 divided by 5 is 4, and 400% more is 5 times damage. So straight away, we can just take the base damage and times it by 5, which is already looking a lot better. Now, this is one of the hardest hitting abilities in a game. It's kind of like Comet in that way. Well, not quite, but we're getting there. Okay, but the thing is, you can actually multiply this benefit by increasing the shock on the enemy with a special stat called Shock Magnitude. So Shock Magnitude is pretty much everywhere on the tree. Even these small nodes have it, and there's basically all of it all over the place here. So by doing this, we can improve our shock here significantly. So if we had, for example, 150% Shock Magnitude, which I'll show you guys on the tree, is very, very doable. Well, we take out 20% before, and we times it by 2.5, now we're at 50. Divided that by 5, and now we're at 10. So now we have 1000% more damage, which is 11 times the damage, which now we're better than a meteor. I'm pretty sure in a lot of cases here. So you guys can see how it gets pretty out of control here on the old Lightning Conduit. Now, what's really, really cool about this though is that scaling Shock Magnitude not only increases the damage of Lightning Conduit, it also double dips. And what I mean by that is that it'll increase the damage in 2 separate places. So you of course get the more damage from the effect of the actual skill, but improving shock itself is a more multiplier. If you have 100% more shock on enemies, so the actual debuff is 100%, that's double damage. 20% is 20% more damage. So first of all, you're increasing the shock damage that you're dealing, the shock multiplier on the enemy, and then you're also increasing the damage of Lightning Conduit, and that's basically 2 multipliers from 1 stat. It's completely crazy, and this is basically double dipping, something which was infinitely broken in PoE 1 for Poison, which could do something similar, and this is now in PoE 2, so of course it's crazy. Alright, so that is the crazy thing. Now, there is a catch though with Lightning Conduit, and that is that when you cast it, you consume the shock after dealing damage. Now, it's important that it's after dealing damage because it still means that you get all the benefits of the shock on the enemy, but it does consume it. So, the beam comes down and the shock is gone, and that is a bit of a problem. But do not fear, that is where the cast on shock shines. So, you're basically spamming Spark constantly, and Spark is constantly shocking the enemy. It's going to be shock, 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 shock. And when the enemy is getting shocked, you're building up cast on shock stacks. And when it gets to the right amount, after you shock an enemy on the right hit, you get just enough energy, and as the enemy gets shocked, the beam comes down and they will remove the shock and get big damage. So basically, there's no scenario in which you're casting a Lightning Conduit where the enemy isn't already shocked by your Spark. So it's like the perfect synergy. It's like peanut butter and jelly. Man, it just goes well, so well together. It's crazy. So there's basically no scenario in which your Lightning Conduit is not dealing giga damage. So that's pretty damn awesome. All right. Okay, so what are we linking to this? Well, we've got Impetus to get our energy breakpoint a little bit easier. We've got Considered Casting. Because we're not casting the Lightning Conduit ourselves, we don't have to take the 10% less cast speed penalty. We just get the 25% more damage, so it's free as hell. Next up, we have Elemental Focus, which is 25% more elemental damage, but we can't inflict elemental ailments. Well, Lightning Conduit is going to remove the shock right after dealing damage anyway, so we don't care. This is free damage as well, no downside. And lastly, we have Inspiration here. Now, you can swap out Inspiration if you want for concentrated effect on bosses. But in my opinion, in mapping, the Inspiration feels a bit better. But on bosses, definitely concentrated effect is more damage, so you guys can go ahead and do that. Okay, so that is the cast on shock setup. It's pretty simple. The big beam comes down, does more damage, the more shock you have. Stack that shock magnitude and ailment magnitude. We'll talk a bit more about that when we get to the gear. Next up, we have Spark. Alright, so Spark is our shock delivery device and also our clearing skill. It actually does pretty good damage by itself as well, and even more thanks to Archmage. Okay, so Spark, we basically want this to be an ultimate giga clear skill, as well as dealing as much shock as possible. So that's what we got. Okay, so we got Acceleration to make sure it's giga clearing, which helps you in those breaches. We've got Overcharge, which is shock magnitude, which we just learned about. Need a lot of that. Don't worry about the shock duration, because remember, when we hit the enemy, we shock them, and immediately after that, cast on shock triggers, and then the beam comes down, immediately removes the shock. So shock duration, who cares? The shock is immediately gone anyway. Okay, next up we have Conduction, which is more chance to shock. We need as much chance to shock as possible so that we're tricking our cast and shock as much as we can. This is very important, and you should try and get as much of it as you can. Next up is Coursing Current. So this is shock proliferation. You shock one enemy and it'll shock all the enemies around it with a 50% chance. Now this is good, it'll help you boost your clear. And the reason for that is that all of the proliferation effects from Coursing Current and the shocks that all kind of spread all around, they all give you energy for cast on shock. So putting in this support will allow you to use your big beam of death way more when clearing. And in breaches, that's why it was coming down so often. Because I shock one mob and it's basically like shocking 10 mobs and they all just shotgun shock each other and then boom, the beams come down and just blow up everything. And that is what we've got there. Now this isn't a mandatory link. You can try with it, you can try without it, just see how it feels. You can put another damage link here instead if you want. And now, because I have enough damage in maps and I'm shocking comfortably, I also have mobility in here to boost my clear speed a bit. Now if you don't want either of these, you could go ahead and look at increased duration, you could look at controlled destruction, you can look at basically any other damage link or quality of life link for your Spark. Pierce is also a really good one if you're not using the setup which I'm about to talk about. So that is going to be the Spark setup. Alright, next and last is Flame Wall. Flame Wall is just a spell which when you put it down and shoot a projectile through it, it adds a ton of flat fire damage. Now, the reason this is good is because the way that Archmage works, it multiplies all the base fire damage and lightning damage and any damage and adds additional lightning on top of that. And by adding a ton of fire damage, we're essentially getting more value from our Archmage, which is improving our damage by shock. So the more damage a Spark does, the more chance it has to shock, the more big beams we're going to get. So put down that Flame Wall, get extra value from Archmage, and you are gaming. On the Flame Wall, we have Spellcast K to get more Flame Walls and more chance to shoot through them, Fire Mastery to get more flat damage, Fortress to make them circles easier to shoot through, and Arcane Tempo to put it down a little bit faster. And that is everything, guys. That is everything you need to know about the gems. Alright, so let's move on to the gear, Ascendency and Tree next. Okay, skill tree is up next. Let's cover the keystones off the rip. We've got Mind Over Matter, we've got Eldritch Battery, and we've got Chaos Inoculation. Now this last one is definitely not mandatory. In fact, I'd even recommend you avoid clicking it until much later in gearing and listen to how I explain things with the reason why I went for it. But yeah, this one is not something you want to pick on every single build, that's for sure. It's definitely a little bit, specialized. But the other two are a no-brainer for this build. So we know already that we get a ton of damage from scaling mana from our Archmage, and that is the goal. We want that. But we also want to scale our defenses and life total if possible. And Mind Over Matter makes both of those things the same thing. Stacking mana is like stacking life, and stacking mana is like stacking damage. Stacking them both, well, you get the same thing at the same time. It's kind of like double dipping we talked about earlier. We get two things from one thing, and that's why Mind Over Matter is so damn strong. But mana is not easy to get in PoE too. It's very, very scarce and very, very rare. So that's why we take Eldritch Battery. Eldritch Battery converts all of our energy shield on gear over to mana. So basically, every time you see an energy shield on your gear, like this one here, 604, that's 604 mana, which is in addition to the mana rolls you can get on your gear. So here we got 243 energy shield, which is mana, and also the 156 mana from the actual item itself. And of course, we have intelligence, which gives us mana as well. So you get quite a lot of mana. And that means that you can get a much higher life total than other characters, well, effective life total. The only people who will beat you is actually pure energy shield characters who can, obviously get like 15k energy shield, but we're interested in scaling damage and life at the same time. And that's why we go ahead and pick Mind Over Matter and Eldritch Battery. And you can still get pretty damn large amounts of life totals with that. Now the last one here, Chaos Inoculation. The reason that we click this, and I can even unspec it so you guys can see what it looks like without Chaos Inoculation spec here, is because Chaos damage is a little bit annoying. It's actually very annoying, in fact. Chaos res on gear is super duper expensive and super duper hard to get alongside other resistances, and there's other rolls that you'd much rather get there. For example, intelligence to get, you guessed it, even more mana. So if we can go without needing to get any chaos resistance and in fact become immune to it, it's actually a huge benefit, and it's actually well worth the downsides that come with clicking Chaos Inoculation here. So you can see I lose 1,300 life by clicking it, but I get 100% chaos resistance. But in addition to that, I also do suffer a crippling affliction. And that crippling affliction from clicking Chaos Inoculation is that you will get stunned by many, many more attacks. Like any attack basically in endgame maps will stun you. The same is also true for freeze. Anything that hits you with cold damage will have a high chance to freeze you. And that means you have to play very, very carefully, because if you just have a white mob come up and hit you, you can get chain stunned, which is very bad. And that is one of the downsides of clicking Chaos Inoculation. So you either need to decide, do I want a little bit more life and also gonna have some resistance against stun and freeze, or do I want to be chaos immune, get even more mana, more flexibility with gear, but also have to play a bit more carefully with my character? That is a decision you have to make. And in addition to that, however, there is a countermeasure, and that is the charm here, which is going to go ahead and make you stun immune every so often. I'd highly recommend getting one of these if you decide to click Chaos Inoculation. Now, obviously, clicking Chaos Inoculation does make you lose a ton of your life, and if you have a low mana amount, well, you're just going to die in one hit to a ton of stuff. So before you even consider clicking Chaos Inoculation, you need to have a certain amount of mana. And I would say the bare minimum, absolute bare minimum, is 3,000. But I would probably wait until 3,500. Okay, so what is going on with the rest of the tree then? Well, we've basically got mana regeneration wherever it counts. So we've got mana regeneration through Arcane Surge Effect here. We've got mana regeneration here. We've got mana regeneration all the way over up here. And we also have mana regeneration over here. And of course, we have mana regeneration here, but also some reduced cost of mana here. All this stuff is basically going to make it so that you're not going to be shredding through your mana pool here. And you're going to be able to have some life as well as some, resources to cast your abilities. So very, very important here. Some people prefer more, some people prefer less. I personally prefer as much as I possibly can get, and I even get this on my gear, but you can get away with less. It's just, you're gonna have to feel it out. It's kind of a bit of an experimental one. The other thing that we want on our tree is, of course, any sources of efficient damage. So a good example of this would be Arcane Intensity here, damage per mana, or Pure Power up here, 2% lightning damage per 10 intelligence. So those are really, really good sources of damage there. Anything which is super efficient like that, we're gonna take it. The other thing we're needing here is lightning penetration. Lightning penetration, we want 75%, so you're gonna get that wherever you can as well. And the final piece of the puzzle here is going to be shock magnitude. Now, shock magnitude is in a few places here. For example, it's down here. There is shock magnitude over here, shock magnitude over here, And I believe there were also is some shock magnitude over here and over here. Now there is obviously a lot more of it all around the tree, but get as much shock magnitude as you can. As we have learned, it double dips, so it's crazy. We want as much of that as we possibly can. And the final thing that we're going for on this tree is going to be jewel sockets. Jewel sockets are just really damn good in PoE 2. They can give you whatever you need. For example, on this one, I have chance to shock, which as we've learned is very good. We have lightning pen, shock magnitude, which those are all our best stats, man. We want all of those. And it also allows you to get, increased meta gem energy, which is our cast on shock. And this is necessary to get the actual amount we need of 151%. So you can get magnitude, energy on here. You can even get maximum resistances if you so desire. So jewel sockets everywhere. They are super duper powerful, and you can get a obscene amount of shock magnitude and element magnitude, which is going to make it really, really strong. So that's pretty much the entire skill tree. We're just clicking on the jewel sockets, clicking on the mana regeneration, and clicking all of the efficient damage nodes. The one exception is up here. You can take skill effect duration, which is very, very potent. It's going to be 45% increased duration here on your spark. Definitely worth considering, but if you don't have the points, you can kind of skip over it. Also worth considering is projectile speed. If you want projectile speed, you can get that here. They're in the same place, you path by it. If you don't have jewels to start with, you can also pick up increased energy here and get a bit of energy here, or alternatively, you can get the energy over here if you so desire, if you don't have the jewels yet and they're a bit expensive. So lots of solutions, lots of band-aids to problems. And it's going to give you a lot of juice here. Of course, we've already talked about jewels, but let's talk about the rest of the gear here and the Ascendency. So the Ascendency, of course, it has to be Stormweaver. So Stormweaver is by far the best mana stacking Ascendency. Just Arcane Surge by itself is crazy. Just having it on at all times, that's more mana regeneration. We need that. But then also having scaling for that mana regeneration from stacking mana, it just goes absolutely psycho. We get more damage from Archmage. We get more damage from the notable up here on the tree, and we also got more damage from Arcane Surge. It's just crazy multiplicative scaling here. It just goes absolutely nuts. So this is obviously a no-brainer, but we also do have a lot of shock interaction here, which strike twice can be very, very effective as well. Now I'm going to be completely honest with you, I don't exactly know how this works with Lightning Conduit, but I think it works like in a crazy way. This basically means that you can have 2 shocks on an enemy. So if you were going to shock for 50%, you can shock for 50% times 2. I have no idea if that doubles the damage bonus of Lightning Conduit. I feel like it might because it's hitting so damn hard, but who knows? I am not sure. Those are the only 3 nodes you actually need on the Stormweaver. So outside of that, you can get shock chance here, and you can get elemental resistances, and that is the entirety of the tree here. Just a bit of scroll around, as you can see here, and that is everything we've got here. Okay, so let's get into the gear now. Alright, to finish this off, let's quickly cover gear. Alright, so it's really, really simple. The very first priority and the top thing you need to look for is resistances. Get 75% all res, and if you're not playing CI, you need 75% chaos as well. That's priority number 1. Priority number 2, get a high mana roll on every piece of gear that can roll mana. And, that's pretty much everything except weapons and body armor. Get that mana, that is your life total, that is your damage, that is everything. Third priority is going to be getting energy shield as high as possible on all the slots without, giving too much up on the previous 2 points I just made. You want big energy shield wherever you can get it. Specifically, the helmet and the chest is where you want the biggest kind of focus on getting as much energy shield as you can. Now, lastly, the 4th point here is there are a few slots which have special stats which you definitely need to look out for. The very first one is going to be the body armor and the amulet. So the body armor and the amulet can roll spirit, and you need spirit. You need a certain amount of it, otherwise you cannot use Cast on Shock and Archmage at the same time. Cast on Shock uses 60, Archmage uses 100. You only start with 100, so you're missing 60. So you're going to need to get that 60 from somewhere, and it's generally going to be a combination of your chest piece and your amulet. So look for that. The next stat you're going to want to look out for is mana regeneration. This can roll on rings, body armor, and the amulet. Now on body armor, it's only an implicit. You need to get the Keth Raiment, but it can roll there. Obviously, mana regeneration is like life regeneration. It is also your main resource. It is your survivability. So you're going to want to go ahead and look for that if you can get it. And then lastly, you're going to want to go ahead and look for, if you can, some special modifiers on your amulet as well. So the amulet can roll plus level of all spell skills, which is crazy damage, but it does increase the mana cost of your abilities as well, so keep that in mind. And it can also roll percentage increased mana, which is also very crazy. You're going to want to get that if you can, but even I don't have that. That is very expensive. That's pretty much all it is when it comes to gear. Now when it comes to runes, I would recommend socketing in iron runes in the helmet and the body armor, because these give the most energy shield. And then in the gloves and boots, you can either choose to socket in 2% extra mana with the soul core, or you can do iron runes if you want. It's up to you. Now, when it comes to weapons, there's a bit to discuss here. So there's two different setups which I recommend using. There is a bossing setup and single target setup, and there is a mapping setup. And you can actually use both if you would like, and you can weapon swap between them. There is no reason you can't. Now, if you intend to use Blink, you have to use this first setup, which is using Widow Hail. And the reason for that is that you can get a 3-socket Widow Hail, which you will be able to socket plus 15 Spirit Soul Cores into. This will give you 45 extra Spirit, which will allow you to get to an additional breakpoint of Spirit where you can have 220 and fit in Archmage, Blink, as well as Cast on Shock. If you don't have Widow Hail, it's very, very hard to do that, so you're going to need Widow Hail. Now, the upside of Widow Hail is that you get to use an incredibly broken quiver. And the quiver you're going to want to look out for is a quiver like this. 40% increased proj speed, you want the implicit of 100% pierce chance, and +2 level of all projectile skills. So the projectile skills are going to boost up your spark damage. The projectile speed is going to make your spark, fly all over the place like you've seen here, and it's just going to zoom all over the place. And then, of course, the pierce is going to make it so you don't need to run pierce in your gem setup, and you can run something else like mobility or more damage, up to you. So that is the quiver, and this multiplies it by 2.5 times, or 3.5 times technically, at a maximum roll. So very, very good there. The quiver setup gives you mass projectile speed, big damage on spark, big pierce, and also blink. Huge mobility, huge quality of life, but you sacrifice a ton of single target damage. So that is a bit of a downside. Now, when you're coming to single target damage, there is only one solution, and that is a huge wand and a huge focus. Now, the good thing about this setup is that you can get way more plus level of skills. You can get really, really good caster mods like damage. You can get shock chance, all sorts of stuff like that. And in addition to that, you can get way higher mana. And the reason for that is because you can roll mana on your weapon and the focus, and you can get energy shield on the focus. So it's crazy. You get way bigger HP pool from this. So you can just see here, by swapping between it, I get way more mana with my other setup. It's crazy. So way more damage, way more survivability with the wand and the focus, way more clear speed, way more mobility with the bow setup. So choose your poison, pick your poison here. It's up to you, or just have both. Why not both? Alright, to finish us off, the most important part of the video here is going to be some quick pros and cons. So the pros, you have huge single target damage, you have incredible AoE clear, you have fantastic mobility when you get a bow setup, and you also have that real feel-good feeling, man. That awesome gameplay, and it's basically like I'm back home, baby. I'm back home. It's like I'm playing Pee-wee 1. It's that kind of a build, and it's really nice and fun, man. And of course, you can also do uber bosses, blast all map content, any lead mechanic, and it's very much an all-rounder. But there are some cons. The very first one is you have zero, and I mean zero, physical mitigation. None. Physical hits deal true damage to you, man. You're gonna get smashed. But don't worry, get enough mana and you can tank it, or just play careful enough and you won't die. Fortunately enough, I am level 93 and I am not good at this game, and I think that's actually a pretty good level, and I've got people who are trying to get on the ladder with this build, so it's not too bad if you play carefully. In a similar vein, you're going to get stunned pretty damn often. You don't have a whole lot of life, you don't have any energy shield, you have no stun threshold. You have to play carefully, or you need to play in a way that if you do get stunned, it doesn't matter. Same deal with freeze, you need to be careful. Those are the biggest downsides. The last downside is that energy shield plus mana gear is expensive, very expensive. So getting your foot in the door, it can be okay to get to like 3k mana, but getting to 3.5, 4, 4.5, that is going to be tough, man. That is going to cost a lot of currency, but if you're okay with currency grinds, maybe it's exactly what you want. That's going to be the build, guys.